Hello, welcome into the Truth About Cars podcast. I am Tim Healy, the managing editor of TTAC, and today we have Sam Smith, automotive journalist and author, stopping by to discuss his new book, Smithology, Thoughts, Travels, and Semi-Plausible Car Writings, 2003 to 2023, as well as TTAC contributor Matthew Guy stopping by to discuss power inverters. We also have NASCAR chat for you all. But first, eBay Motors is here for the ride with some elbow grease, fresh installs, and a whole lot of love. You transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own. Brake kits, LED headlights, whatever you need, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Motors Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. So today, we'll learn all about power inverters, and our conversation with Sam Smith should be a delight. Finally, we have to cover why the good old boys just can't stop fighting in NASCAR. Here in the Truth About Cars podcast, we like to talk about the things that we use in our own home, the automotive products that we use on our own cars and in our own homes. But first, a reminder that eBay Motors is here for the ride with the parts you need at the prices you want. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, they're guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. So with the stuff we use, we're going to talk about power inverters today, and we're bringing in Matthew Guy to talk about it. Matthew Guy, how are you doing?
Doing pretty good. How about you?
I'm doing well. So Matthew, I don't know a lot about power inverters, and I assume some of our listeners don't either. So can you first tell us what they do and why you would want one?
Absolutely. So the way that I like to think about them is that it allows you to use some household appliances in your car. And why might you want to do that? I mean, because of Ralph Nader, we don't have dashboard hotchkiss, for example, right? So
probably a good thing.
Probably. Or, our windshield wash reservoirs are routinely filled with salad dressing, right? We can't do any of that because Ralph Nader was born. But the fun thing about these inverters is that it does allow you to bring some of, whether it's an appliance or a tool or something like that, on the road with you. And just springs to mind the all of the plugins that are in a F-150 Lightning up in that frunk, for example.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times people use that to charge up their tools or to keep a cooler running or something like that whilst they're driving. So these inverters allow you to invert the 12-volt power that's coming from your car into 110-volt and AC type power supply. So that way you can run those types of things.
Cool. Is there a particular one that you use that you'd recommend, and why?
So the one that I have, it's a brand that's just called Best Tech. I mean, it's nothing, it's not like DeWalt or anything like that, but I haven't had any problems with it in the years that I've had it. It's a 2,000 watt power inverter, and you can get these that plug into your cigarette lighter, for example, or you're not supposed to call them that anymore. Plug into your PowerPoint,
right?
And
right.
they hoover electricity from your car that way. And in the early days of having a Dodge Charger that didn't have any USB ports, I used them for plugging in devices. Right, so you have your cube. Into which you could plug your USB, and then you could charge up your device, because these power inverters allow you to plug in something like a household device, so you could use the cube just like you're plugged it into your wall at home. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of the genesis of that. And there was actually one that I had that was the shape of a large coffee. Okay, it was pretty neat because you could just put it in your cup holder, right? And because it wasn't drawing too much power, it was able to hoover up its electricity from the cigarette lighter, from the PowerPoint. And that was fine, because that's the only thing I ever used it for, was charging up devices. But later on, you get a Jeep and you decide that you're going to go a bit of off-roading, bit of overlanding, stuff like that. You're going to be running more powerful electronics. You're going to be running more powerful appliances like fridges. Fridges especially take up a huge amount of wattage.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
Right? Especially, it's interesting because they don't consume too many watts whilst they're running, but when the condenser kicks in, that's when it peaks, right? So that's when it draws a lot of power right off the top. So as soon as that compressor cuts in, once it's going, it's not too bad, but it's that cutting in and cutting out that really draws a lot of power. So these tools that I have there, so these have eyelets, and you wire them directly into your car, right? And there's all kinds of instructions. And if you're not comfortable with it, take it to a mechanic and make sure that, because it is electricity, you want to make sure you get it right. But follow the instructions, take your time. 99% of people, if you've installed speakers, if you've done a more difficult task like installing brakes, if you follow the instructions with these things, you'll be just fine.
Excellent. Is there any brand that you've had a bad experience with and would say we should maybe stay away from?
I did have a bad experience with one that I bought at the, of course, dollar store, right? Which is the last outpost of bad electronics these days. Because my thought at the time was that for things like HDMI cables and things like that, they're not analog, right? They're digital, so they're either on or off. And I was thinking the same thing might have applied to this, but no, there's a lot more going on in this than just a simple HDMI cable that is okay to pick up from the dollar store. So stay away from those. The one that I got here from eBay Motors, it was reviewed really well. It had nearly a 5-star rating based on 1,251 ratings. And I would rather go with a brand, just for me, and a product that has 4.4 stars out of 1,250 ratings and 5 stars on 10 ratings. I don't know if you agree or not, Tim. What do you think?
I don't really, when I shop online, I don't really think too much about the reviews, because a lot of reviews are fake or written by bots or bots, not bots. But I do pay attention to them, but only to a point. So I'm not sure, really. I'm sorry. I guess I agree with you, just to make it simple. But Speaking of shopping online, so you probably can buy these things. I'm sure you can. I know you can buy these off eBay, but eBay Motors. But what kind of pricing are we looking for? What is this going to set you back on the average?
Absolutely. I mean, if you have something like this one that's 2,000 watts, so you'll be able to run numerous devices at once. This one shouldn't be any more than $200. Don't spend any more than $200 for something that's 2,000 watts. Something that's half that, about 1,000 watts, don't spend much more than 100. I know this is very, very, almost like I'm making it up, but if it's 2,000, don't spend no more than 200. If it's 1,000 watts, don't spend no more than 100. Just hack off the last zero.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and the same thing would go. This is a very similar tool, but of course it draws its power from your car. But it's a very similar tool to a gas-powered generator that you would have for your home, right? Except that device consumes gasoline to spin a electric motor to create electricity. This just draws the power and converts it, takes it from your car. So, but the genesis of it is the same. So if you've got a 2,000 watt power inverter in your rig, whether it's an overlanding thing or just in your car, you've got a fair amount of power. Just as an example, let's say the Ford Maverick, you would have a plug in the box of that car, right? Of that little truck. And that one peaks at 400 watts, just to give you an idea of what you can do. Some of our listeners might be familiar with the Instant Pots, which you can use to cook stuff, right?
I've got something like that, yeah.
Exactly, right? So that won't run off 400 watts. You need more than 400 watts to do it. But 2,000 is plenty.
Okay.
And I know because I tried.
You didn't have any problems? No problems? No blown fuses? Nothing?
Nothing. And these little 2,000 watt inverters, they come with fuses. So they're very easy to service. If something did happen to go wrong, it's no different than popping a fuse out in your car. If you're comfortable doing that, you can be comfortable doing this. I do find, and it's not unique to this unit that I have, that they can get a little bit noisy because there is a high-speed cooling fan there just to dissipate any heat that's generated from the unit.
About as noisy as a laptop, or a little bit louder, or?
Actually, yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good allegory. It's about as noisy as a laptop.
That's not too bad then.
It's not outrageous.
So, Matthew, before we wrap the segment today for this episode, I know you already touched upon if you follow the instructions, you should be fine. But we are dealing with electronics. Are there any safety issues, in terms of like we said, maybe blowing a fuse, or I can't imagine anything else. But are there any safety issues to watch out for? Or is this all pretty safe?
And they are pretty straightforward and pretty safe. The neat thing is that once they're installed, you can have them in your car or in your Jeep or in your SUV and start using them right away. There's nothing special. There's no tricks you need to use. You just plug your devices in and start using them. So very safe. Installed properly, of course, they're very safe. And generally, this one especially comes with some really long leads. So when the person who's installing them, they have a lot of options on where they can position this thing. So it doesn't look like it's just plunked on the top of your dashboard. You can tuck it away in the back of your cargo area, for example, or maybe put it in somewhere in the back seat area if it's going to be used by passengers and stuff like that. The only thing I would ask for on this is some built-in USB ports, but that's what one of the outlets is for. I'll put a USB port in there, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So, highly recommended, put it that way. Highly recommended.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time on this, Matthew, and we'll be coming back at you on the TTAC podcast in just a minute. What does the perfect fit mean to you? How would it feel if the part you purchased fit your ride perfectly the first time? To me, it means simply that you would have no inconveniences. Your repairs would go smoothly every time, and you would have your ride rolling quickly. And there's one good way to get the perfect fit, because with over 122 million parts, you can make sure that your number one ride or die stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof racks, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber and not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, and exclusions apply. Welcome back into the Truth About Cars podcast. I'm Tim Healy, the managing editor for the Truth About Cars, and we are here today with Sam Smith, automotive journalist and author. How are you doing today, Sam?
I'm not too bad. Thanks for having me.
So, Sam, can you walk us through your background in automotive journalism and writing in general real quick?
Oh, man. So I've been doing this about 20 years. I've worked for most of the car magazines in this country and a bunch of others out there. I was a mechanic after I left college, have an English literature degree, worked at Road and Track as executive editor and editor at large for 8 years, was a chief track texter for a bit, and have done pretty much a version of the job that very few people get to do. I'm really fortunate. Traveling the world and testing everything from, multi-million-dollar race cars to $500 Econo boxes in the middle of nowhere. So basically, it was my job for a long time, was to go and have adventures and then come back and tell people what they were like.
And that's actually why we're having you on today, because you have written about this in book form. The book is called Smithology, Thoughts, Travels, and Semi-Plausible Car Writings, 2003 to 2023. So, Sam, I unfortunately have not had a chance to read the book yet, but can you kind of walk us through what it's about? It looks like to me it's kind of a anthology style where it's not just one narrative, but a bunch of different short stories.
Yeah. So I've worked for a bunch of different places over the years. I've been really fortunate, but did a lot of the core of my career kind of happened at Road and Track. And a lot of that work, the way magazines work, you work really hard on something. You slave to put it together for months. In some cases, it means you're working on a trip or some kind of weird adventure that takes months of planning, and then you go and you do it. You're off in the middle of nowhere, and then you come back, and it runs, and it kind of withers away and doesn't end up appearing for lack of a better term anywhere else. And I've been in the business two decades. It feels like about 5 minutes, but got to the point where I looked at a lot of the writing I'd done and people had been bugging me for years. I'm lucky to have a pretty healthy following of people who enjoy my work, and people had asked for a book. And so I finally had some time and got and put it together. So it's 20 years of writing kind of condensed down into my favorite stories. So it's adventures, columns, road trips, travel pieces, interviews, bio pieces, just kind of a cross section of how car culture works, and everything from, there's a story in there. I ended up being lucky enough to race at the Goodwood Revival about 10 years ago. But, the other side of that is, there's a long piece I wrote when my mom passed away and how that tied to cars, relationships with people, going to Europe, and 1,000 things. So it's kind of just a dip into it, aimed at a a pretty broad audience why and how we care about cars and what we get out of it.
Yeah, and as you talk about this, now I'm kind of kicking myself for not doing a better job of saving my own clips, or at least the ones I really liked, and putting them together. Although I don't think anything is as interesting as some of the stuff that I've read that you've written. That being said, what sort of inspired you to put it all together? What made you think, and you sort of touched on it a little bit, what made you think like, hey, I should go back and dig up XYZ essay or story or road trip or adventure, get it off the internet? Was it just, I want to have it all in one place? Was it the fact that digital media, sometimes even really great stories, can disappear when corporate ownership changes? Was it just, something else I'm not even thinking about? What kind of inspired you?
Well, it's the business is, as you know, as a lot of people listening to this probably know, the business has changed a great deal in the last 20 years. Media is a very hard place. It's always been a hard place to make a living, but it's a very hard place to make things that have any substance to them, simply because the way we consume writing and video and audio and anything, all of that stuff is geared toward what sells. And looking around, looking around at the way the business has changed, I realized that a lot of the work that I was lucky enough to do doesn't get done anymore. And I don't mean that in the sense of boohoo or, we should all live in the past, more just the sense that a lot of these stories took a lot of time and a lot of money to pull off. And that's just not how media outlets work anymore. I mean, there was a point 4 or 5 years ago when I drove a Jeep with no doors to the Arctic Circle simply because we could, to take a look at how and why what we pull from the earth and how we think about the resources we use through the lens of the machines and where they take us and how they take us there. And in the end, that ended up being, like I said, weeks of planning. And we ended up having to get a Jeep all the way up to Fairbanks, Alaska, and then ended up in an oil well town, standing on the beach at the Arctic Ocean at the top of the planet. And it was this big, long endeavor to make that happen. And at the time, it was just like, yes, we need to do this. This is something the magazine should do. It's a great story. And the further I get from things like that, the more I realize that it's, these are a wonderful little lucky moments in time. And looking at those things, I realized that I don't know if this kind of work is ever going to come around again, if it's going to be possible to do again. And I just wanted to, part of it was selfish. I wanted to put it together and have it for me, for my kids. And part of it was wanting to share it and wanting to kind of see if we could pull some larger point out of it. It was a lot of fun putting it together, though.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. So you raise a good point. I think it is more difficult in today's climate to do some of these stories. And I'll share a little bit of my own background here, not as a writer, but as a reader. Growing up reading car magazines, I always found the John Phillips adventure stories interesting in Car and Driver, or some of the stuff that you've done, some of the stuff where it was less about the car and more about the adventure. And so it would be nice to see. It's just difficult these days, and this is not a shot at any one corporate entity. It's kind of across the board. It is hard right now to put the resources into these trips, the money into these trips, unless you're an automaker. It is hard to put the kind of money forward, and then the return for it is often just not there. So I hope that changes, but it is kind of a bummer that we're not getting as many of these adventure trips as we used to.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Tim, too, because those, you mentioned John Phillips, right? I grew up reading guys like Phillips, guys like Peter Egan, and their stories were always focused on the why and less so the how, right? Car magazines, car websites, YouTube channels, all that stuff lives and dies on what the sheet metal does, but there's so much more beneath it, right? Because ultimately, a car without a person in it is just a lump. It's plastic and glass and steel, and there's not much there that's compelling if you stop looking at it as a piece of sculpture. The humanity in it, what it took to make that thing exist, what it does for people once it goes into the world, how it changes and evolves when it enters your driveway, my driveway, the hills outside my house, the junkyard at the end of its life. All that stuff is so much more compelling than simply what the engine or the motor controller or the battery does and why. And those stories, the Egan, the John Phillips work, all of that stuff was always geared toward finding the space between spaces. What and how makes this stuff tick. For me, that was why I got into the business to begin with, because it's the human side of it, right?
Yeah, I agree. That's an interesting part of it, because car reviews, they're fun to write and they're great, and we all have our opinions, and there's a subjective element, and I can say this car handles a certain way and try and find the best phrase to describe it, and oftentimes fail. But there's more to it. Most car reviews are going to be read by people who just need to know whether they should buy the car or not, and they're going to forget about you 5 minutes later, and that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. It's the same way I consume most movie reviews, right? Like, there's a few movie critics that I would go back to all the time, especially when their print was more prevalent 10, 15 years ago. But most of the times now, I'm just looking for a quick, is the movie good or not? Is it worth my money or not? And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's probably 80 to 90% of the business. But it's the other 10 to 20% of the human element, what makes things really interesting. And that's why when you're talking about movie reviews, I'm just using this as an example, why you might read a feature about the movie where it goes into a little more depth about the actor or the director or the history of the story, if it's based on a true story, that sort of thing. And so it's like you said, the human element. So bringing it back to cars, I can read a Land Rover review anywhere or write one when I get a Land Rover test car or go on a Land Rover first drive, and maybe it'll be a good review, maybe it won't. Maybe it'll help someone's purchase decision, maybe it won't. But what's more interesting is reading someone, especially someone who can write well, taking a Land Rover to Patagonia or Iceland, or I don't know, it can be someplace even goofier than that. It doesn't have to be someplace adventurous. It could be, I took a Land Rover to this suburban mall where it's going to be driven by all the soccer parents or whatever. I don't know. Anything fun, Like if you have a Rolls Royce, I took a Rolls Royce to Menards when I had a Rolls Royce test car. I didn't write a story on it. I just did a standard review. But that was kind of funny, parking a Rolls Royce in a Menards to go in there to buy $2 screws for a chair I was putting together. So it's kind of, I think there's creativity in a human element. And the reason I bring that up is, like you said, cars are just inanimate objects that we assign passion to. And I think, if you're taking the Rolls Royce to Menards or the Land Rover to the Arctic Circle or whatever, it's not just about what the car can or can't do, or how the car is part of your companion as you drive, but it is the human element, right? Like, it is weird to take a Rolls Royce to Menards. It is not weird to take a Toyota Camry to Menards. It is unique to take a Land Rover, even though it's built for it, or some models would be built for it, to Iceland, but it's still Iceland. Iceland's not a place that most of us get to go very often, if at all. So there is a human element, right? And I think it's one of those things kind of hard to put into words. I'm struggling a little bit, but it's definitely more interesting than just saying, oh, this car is fast, or oh, this car is slow. And we can't do that with every story for obvious reasons. We don't have the resources or the time, nor does every vehicle lend itself to that kind of thing. But when it can be done and done well, it's just awesome to read.
Yeah. You mentioned film reviews, right? This is going to sound very strange, but one of my writing, not necessarily heroes, but a guy I always looked up to was Roger Ebert, who, it's interesting because he had this whole career that was predicated on writing a column in the Chicago Sun-Times for a long time.
Yeah, I read Ebert a little bit growing up. Sure.
Yeah. And also he had a TV show, and his whole career was kind of condensed down in most people's memory into the thumbs up, thumbs down thing he did. He'd read a movie and it was thumbs up, thumbs down, or sometimes they'd kind of go in the middle. And yet Ebert, he was this massively eloquent writer. And this was never more obvious than toward the end of his life. He got, I forget, he had a form of cancer. He died sort of young. I think only 70. Yeah, and it ended up being kind of a long and drawn out process that took a lot from him. And in that period, he ended up losing his voice. And one of the things, he had a tracheotomy, but one of the things that kept him going was writing about the process. And so he started writing about it. He started writing about what it was like to be a writer without a voice, and what it was like to be an enthusiast of movies, of film, to love something so deeply, and why he got into it. And one of the things that he said was that, the job of a critic, most people think it's to say, well, this movie is good or bad. This is a B- movie or an A+ movie. He said that's part of it. But the core of that thing, the core of that lens is always trying to figure out why we love the things we love and why they work the way they do. And when they don't work, unpacking them and pulling them apart and helping explain why. Why a piece of art. And if you don't, some people don't believe this, but I firmly believe that, machines, the things we make, are industrial art. A Camry is just as much a piece of kind of functional pop art as is a Ferrari, right? Mm-hmm. But he believed that the whole reason to do that was to help people understand it better and talk about why we do feel the way we do, on the grounds of helping us love it more. Because when you understand something, when you know why it works or how it works, or even just a little bit of why it makes you feel a certain way, you tend to appreciate it a little more. And that for me was always the draw, right? People tend to love car people into a monoculture. Like, we're all the same. We all love, crossing our arms on TV and Mustangs and, build shows. But in reality, it's as broad as people. I loved that, and that's what the book is. That's where the book goes. So much of the stories in it are just trying to figure out how and why through the lens of hundreds of different cultures. I mean, I went to Japan and pulled apart, visited Dodge van culture, this whole cult of people who take Dodge vans on racetracks. I ended up in England.
I'd never heard of that.
Oh, it's amazing. You should it's absolutely bonkers. We could talk. I could talk about that for hours, but the point is, it was always, the whole draw with all of it was just figure out why. And there's no answer. The answer is because we're human, but that's the kind of thing you talk about for years. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. And that's one thing that's always drawn me, or actually I shouldn't say drawn me, but always kind of thought, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. It's one thing that's always kind of had me stumped about why we love cars. Because cars are, for a lot of people, are just point A to point B. Just give me the car at the best fuel economy for the lowest price, and that it won't break down. It won't cost me a ton of money. And that's fine. I get it. That's how most of us look at a lot of things. I don't care about my dishwasher or my refrigerator much. I mean, you want them to look good, so when people are at your house, they, fine. And you want them to work well and not break and all that stuff. But for the most part, cars are the only thing outside of maybe homes that we interact with on a daily basis where we think about that, really. And homes, a lot of people stay in their homes for decades, right? Where cars, you might be in a new car every year or two or three, depending on how you do things. So some people get into boats and small planes, but those are for mostly wealthy people, right? And those are more of a necessity, or I'm sorry, those are more of a luxury than a necessity. Most people need a car. Very few people need a boat or a plane. And so outside of cars, I have a hard time really wrapping my head around anything else that we use as a machine that we really get so emotional about and get so wrapped up in. And it just kind of always blows my mind that we think about this way. And you can think about movies in a similar way, but movies are a passive thing. You put it in your DVD player, you go to the theater, you find it on TV. Cars, we actually drive, we interact with, we clean, all that sort of stuff. We ride in even as a passenger. So why are we so emotional about cars, or at least a certain percentage of the population anyway?
Well, it's funny, right? Think about what I find amazing about it. And I don't, let me kick this off by saying, I have no idea, Tim. I don't know. But the thing that hits me is, there are so few machines, so few things we've made that had as big an impact on how the world works, how we see each other, how we see distance, how we relate between cultures, as silly and kind of like sociology 101 as that sounds, right? Nothing we've built arguably has had, shy of the transistor and the personal computer, nothing we've made has had as much of an impact on how the world works and how we think about each other as the car. And in the end, if you don't have any feelings about it, I think that's perfectly okay. I happen to love my toaster, but I'm also deeply indifferent about my refrigerator. Right. For some people, it is just an appliance, and that's okay. But the fact, I think it's more remarkable that it ends up just being an appliance for most people than the fact that people get attached to it. People like you and me and anybody who ends up going to car shows, track days, racing, anybody who falls into the weird kind of overlapping 1,000 Venn diagrams of car culture, because it's, how could you have this machine that lets you go almost anywhere at the drop of a hat, that has a personality, that was built by people expressing themselves, that, is on the same entropic treadmill as the rest of us, right? It's being used up and will eventually be thrown away. It's here in the moment, and it puts you in the moment. The fact that some people get into that and have zero feelings at all, it's like, well, wow, I mean, I can't not, it's just proof of how different we are. But all of us.
Yeah. And there's no dishwasher and user magazine, right? Like there's car
right.
No, and I am glad you brought up phones and computers, because that is one thing I forgot. There are some people, especially with cell phones now, where there is a little bit of personalization in terms of the apps that you use, the way you set up your home screen, even your case. A lot of people have, cases they can, when they put their phone out in public, it kind of show off the personality a little bit. So there is some, with some computers, especially certain Macs, and then with phones, there is a little bit of emotional attachment. It's not the same as with a car, I don't think, but there are some people who really do care about whether they have an iPhone or an Android and what the case looks like and the camera and all that sort of thing. So cars aren't the only machine that we interact with on a daily basis that are somewhat expensive that we get emotional about, but they're probably the most noticeable one for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I want to bring it back to your book a little bit. We've been kind of just hitting some high-level philosophical ground, but I'd love to bring it back to your book just a bit. No, it's great. That's exactly what the conversation I thought we'd have. But I wanted to just, I'm not going to read an excerpt on air or anything like that, but I wanted just you to pick a story or a highlight from the book that you really loved. I see the dog that runs away from the squirrels. I think I remember reading this article on Road and Track. I feel like I read this when you drove the Formula One car, which those cars are so impossible to drive, especially at speed. That just blows me away that you were able to do that. I'm looking at a couple other things here, I'd like to also know why there's a raw chicken in the unicorn suit. But if you want to pick out one anecdote from the book that you really would encourage people to read, I know you already mentioned the Japanese Dodge van racing. So is there something that you really think, hey, if you buy my book, this is the part you should read first, or the part you should reread the most, because it's just awesome.
Well, first off, I'd like to inform everyone listening that every single page of this book is incredible, and you should read all of it.
I didn't mean to imply that there were better parts.
Of course, everything has sine waves in it. No, the Dajiban thing is definitely up there. There is, for people who don't know, Tim was reading the Amazon description. The book's on Amazon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't bought the book, unfortunately.
No, that's okay. But the Dajiban thing is definitely up there. Several years ago, I went to Japan and spent a week up near Ebisu Circuit with a small, I wouldn't call them a cult. I called them a cult earlier, and that has negative connotations. More just a small band of kind of deeply enthusiastic crazies who got attached to 80s and 90s Dodge vans, right? Like the stuff.
Are they like Lemons people here, or is it different?
No, it's entirely different. Then these are like the stuff you see, people using as church vans and the plumbers drive around in, and they.
Oh, so I had like Dodge Caravan in my mind. I wasn't thinking like the 15-passenger church vans. Yeah. Oh, this is really crazy. I was thinking like the Dodge Caravan your mom might take you to school. No, this is like.
So there's 15-passenger. This entire culture of people that's probably 400 or 500 people deep across the entire country that they modify them, they hop them up, they lower them, they've had custom Watanabe wheels made for them, which are somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 a set, depending on how you make them. They modify them to take Ferrari F430 calipers. They put headers on them and try and extract all the power you can out of that motor, which that Dodge V8 is not exactly a nuclear reactor waiting to happen. But it came about because there were a handful of motorcycle racers in Japan about 10 years ago who would take their bikes to the track of these things. And one day, like the Japanese, the way they approach kind of whimsy and things that aren't supposed to happen outside the lines of quote unquote normal life, there's this cultural undercurrent of kind of, should we be doing this? This is amazing mirth about it. And they apparently at one lunch break at one of these bike track days, somebody got a wild hair and stuck one out on the track, and then somebody else did, and then they started dialing them up to work better. And all of a sudden, 10 years later, there was this whole custom culture around it where, they've built the things and people just keep kind of gravitating toward them. There's one shop in Tokyo that specializes in them, but it's like anything else American in Japan. There's a core group of people who are really into it. But that story was this wonderful uplifting experience where I kind of had I don't know, just a big kind of clean slate wash of, this is why we do this. This is the core of, car culture. It tends to bifurcate, tends to slice off into, you should do this, you shouldn't do this. This is how you have a Porsche 911. You should buy these wheels if you like this. If you have a Corvette, you don't do this with it. Well, you're wrong. All this horse apple stuff that doesn't really matter. And I had this great, wonderful experience in this culture, people who didn't care about rules, who didn't care that there was a right way or a wrong way to do any of it. That was it was marvelous. And there's a dozen stories like that in the book. I could go on and on, but I mean, it's so much of the book is rooted in, I don't know, like I said, why we do these things and the different ways you can look at it.
Yeah, it almost strikes me as, in a weird way, like people who joke, oh, we should race the golf cart when you're at a racetrack. It almost sounds like they did that, but with the Dodge Vans instead of the golf carts, which golf carts would be timed in like hours. Oh, it took you about 25 minutes to get on, make it out there. Yeah. Or the Vans are probably a little faster, but no, I'm looking actually at the Road and Track story you wrote right now, and that's I had not seen it before, and it's actually pretty cool. Some of the photography of the inside of these Vans is pretty awesome. I'm looking at the one. It's a shot from the passenger side door is open, and the engine is right there in the middle. Yeah, and it's just awesome. Yeah, and I think you raise a great point about not being judgmental about how that's when car enthusiasts always fight, right? And I know I've been guilty of it too. I don't like the way certain stances are on cars, and kind of always, and it's like, I really shouldn't care. It's not my business, right? As long as it's legal, I shouldn't care as long as it's legal, not hurting anybody else. I really shouldn't care if it's something I don't like, then so be it. I don't like it, but I don't have to judge it. And it actually brings me back to a piece of advice I got from another automotive journalist we both might know, who said that you shouldn't. I actually apologized for liking a certain band that I like because I thought it was cheesy and corny. And he's like, "Why are you apologizing? You should. Who cares if you like this musician? It doesn't matter. If you like it, who cares?" And that advice has stuck with me for the past decade. Like we often judge people on things that are subjective, and whether it's cars or music or film, and it's like, we really shouldn't. Who cares? Who cares if you like horror and I like comedy? Who cares if you like your Corvette stance and I like my Corvette stock? Like, not that I've ever seen a stance Corvette, that just popped in my head. But yeah, and I think with just bringing it back to the Dodge racing vans or Dodgy van, it's just really cool to sort of like, hey, instead of saying why instead of saying we can't do this because these are not meant for the track, it's like more like, why not? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because I firmly believe that as long as you're not harming anyone else, as long as you're not getting in the way of someone else's happiness and taking something away from society, like do what you want. If it comes down to which pants you're wearing or what color you're painting your car or whether your 65 Corvette should have these wheels or that interior vinyl. If somebody has a problem with that, who cares? Go away, find somebody else who doesn't. We're on this earth for such an eye blink, and in the end, it's like, do you really get to 86 years old and sit there and think, I shouldn't have gone with the chrome Kraigars? God, that was a terrible choice. Right. Nobody does that. It doesn't happen.
Right. I shouldn't have liked this band because they were unpopular, but I like them. Yeah, exactly. Right. Or because they're popular but considered to be cheesy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I get it. It's and it really applies to cars a lot. That's why I brought up music, because music and cars and film have a lot in common when it comes to personal taste and subjectivity. And I think there's a lot of the same philosophies apply, so it's really interesting. And I think another thing, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I think that's the relevant point, right? Those things you just listed are all things that people get really invested in. We care about them deeply, and we tend to believe that, it's very, very easy to kid yourself into thinking that the way you're looking at things or doing things is the right way, when in reality, it's what works for you. Again, as long as you're not hurting someone, as long as you're not taking away someone else's inalienable rights, like it's simply what works for you, and that's fine. The other side of the coin is like, it can be really difficult to kind of erect a wall and not let that, look, this works for me so well, you should do it. And also that thing doesn't work for me, don't do it. Like that's gibberish, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to bring it back to the book. Another thing that I really caught my eye looking over the book, looking over the stories that are being mentioned as kind of highlights of the book. You had a chance to drive a Formula One car. And like I said, I'm fairly certain I read this. I remember, I definitely recall reading an article on Road and Track where you drove an F1 car. I'm not sure it's the same one, but I'm assuming it probably is. A 2007 McLaren. That had to be an amazing experience. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So that car was a 2007 McLaren MP. I was an MP422 that Fernando Alonso, who is still racing remarkably. He's in his 40s. He's as old as me, which just makes me think, wow, I've done nothing with my life.
Well, there's a lot of race car drivers who push well into their 40s now, especially with being able to stay in shape better and all that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, the fact that he's still dragging cars, subpar cars, to be honest, to the front of the grid. The fact that he's still in one of the most competitive series in the world, the most physically taxing series in the world. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so the car was like I said, it was 07. I believe he used it for, I want to say it won the European Grand Prix at the Red Bull Ring and also won Monaco. But it was, it's hard to describe how much of an otherworldly experience that was. It's very easy when you drive fast cars for a living to get to thinking that it's all the same, that, once you've been in 1,000 horsepower something or a 500 horsepower something, that, okay, speed is just more speed. And that once you've driven something relatively small and light and nimble, that, all right, an F1 car is basically just that. But it's not. Even then, these are space age things that are analyzed and obsessed over every single minute of their working life and then thrown away the moment they're no longer useful, which is the end of the season, right? And they pull immense loads. At the time they were pulling something like, I want to say 4 Gs in corners and close to 5 under braking. That there's enough aero download, there's enough downforce coming out of a late 2000s McLaren the old line is that, they make enough downforce to drive on the ceiling, but really that's not much. It doesn't take that much to do it. What people don't tell you is that they make enough downforce that in a fast corner on a fast racetrack, you won't be able to hold your head up unless you train for it. There's a video on Instagram maybe it's YouTube, from years and years ago of Alonso in his prime, in his 20s. He's in a palazzo in Spain or somewhere, surrounded by fans, and you can hear somebody asking him to do the trick. And he's like, no, and he blushes, and he kind of waves it off, and then he finally does it, and the trick involves a walnut. He puts a walnut in his neck muscles, in the crook of his neck and his shoulder, right above his collarbone, and then kind of winces and kicks his head to the right, and cracks the walnut with his muscles. And you watch it happen, and it's like, what? How is that possible? And then you start pulling into what the cars take to drive competitively. And that's how they have to train. They have walnut tree necks, tree necks like the trunk of a tree, because if they don't, they won't be able to hold up their head and that helmet in 180 mile an hour corner when they're pulling 4 lateral Gs, when their body weighs 4 times what it normally does, while also, playing a 90-minute chess match with a bunch of other people who desperately want them to fail, and doing what they're doing, flying basically a low-flying fighter jet with inch-perfect precision around a place that is ultimately safe. Racetracks are safer than they've ever been, but you can still die in a Formula One car. And that's the whole experience was bonkers. It took months and months of logistics. We ended up renting Indianapolis Motor Speedway, used the road course there. I got, I want to say, 9, 10, 12 laps. And
I think you said 8 in the article.
Something like that. Yeah. The car uses, it's got an engine that I forget what its life is limited to in kilometers, and they dialed the RPM limit back. This was in the era of extremely high RPM V8s. They were turning like 17, 18, 19,000 RPM. And the way those engines work, if you pull a few thousand RPM off the top and let's say the rev limit is 19,000 in a race or in qualifying, and you drop it down to 17, well, that doubles or sometimes triples the life. Mm-hmm. And the life might be like 800 kilometers before it has a rebuild, and that rebuild might cost twice as much as my house. But so when I say, when we say eight laps, it was one of those things where I went out, did a couple laps, and came back in, and every ounce of that experience, there's still parts of it that I can't process, that I'm still thinking about. It was bonkers.
No, I'm sure it was. And it actually brings me, before I actually bring it up to my next question, it actually makes me, I'm glad you mentioned the whole part about the physical aspect of it, because people forget about that. Even those of us who watch racing on a fairly regular basis, and we've been doing some NASCAR coverage as part of our podcast. I've been watching NASCAR a lot this year. I did watch F1 this last weekend because it was in Miami, so it was TV friendly for me and not getting up at crazy hours of the morning or DVRing it.
Yeah.
People forget, I think, how physically demanding it is to drive a race car, whether it's a NASCAR stock or an F1 Indy car. The closest I've ever came was I did the Richard Petty thing like 10 years ago as a birthday gift, and it was much more physically demanding than I imagined. My contacts shook loose at speed because the vibration was so heavy. I couldn't see. I had to back out of the throttle a little bit, and it cost me, I wanted to hit 150. I hit 149.7 or something. So the backing off the throttle cost me the 150, which doesn't matter. I was that close anyway. But it's just like, it's a point of it's so physically taxing. It really is. And we had 8 minutes. I can imagine doing that for 4 hours with brief breaks for pitting, and the pit breaks are 20, 30 seconds plus the time driving in and off the apron at highway speeds. So for 8 minutes, I was worn out. I was done. They're like, you can't, you can only do one time a day, basically. And anyway, I think people forget that as we watch racing on TV because it looks so easy from your couch, and it's not. And so I'm glad you brought that up, but I also wanted to kind of pick your brain, as someone who was considered good enough at track driving to drive this car. You are one of the few automotive journalists who I've met and who I've read who I would consider accomplished on track. There's a few others, both the Baruth brothers who have written for TTAC in the past, some of the car and driver folks, some other folks I've read over the years have now retired or since passed on. And a couple people had passed actually in accidents. But, most automotive journalists, myself very much included, are not track rats. A lot of us didn't come up in racing. I came up in the world of journalism and fell into cars. I always liked cars. I was an enthusiast, but I didn't come up as a racing background. I didn't go kart as a kid. I wasn't an engineer. I wasn't testing vehicles for an automaker the way some journalists fell into the industry. So for someone like you, first of all, what is your background in racing? And second of all, any advice to our listeners who might have a chance to go SCCA racing on the weekends, maybe even if they're just doing Lemons cars at relatively low speed or autocrossing, or someone like myself, an automotive journalist who has some track experience but could stand to get a lot better, a lot faster. What advice would you give to someone who is getting some track experience, wants to get better?
Oh man, we asked to start with my background, I guess. So just to give a broad overview, I grew up around a restoration shop, started kind of autocrossing in college, which you can do for, at the time it was $20. You'd show up and get a day's worth of learning how to drive at the limit in the parking lot around cones without hurting anything.
Autocrossing is the best way for a beginner, I think, other than karting. Yeah.
And then kind of, I was extremely stupid in that I got out of college with an English literature and journalism degree and desperately wanted to be around cars. And so I sold all of the things I had and put every last disposable income into track days, and then kind of graduated into club racing with the Sports Car Club of America and a handful of other outfits. And all of that was, it was the big thing with any of this is, it's no secret that car culture takes money to be a part of beyond just kind of dipping a toe in. And so, I was trying to go club racing on a budget that probably wouldn't have sustained, a year in competitive ping pong, right? And so I did it. You go out there and you realize, oh no, I'm not good enough. And what part of that is me, and what part of that is the car? And there are people going faster than I am. And is it a mistake I made, or is it because I'm on used tires and the engine's really tired and I'm trying to stretch, this, that, and the other. And I didn't really eat breakfast, and I slept in the truck last night because I slept in the truck the night before because we didn't have money for even a tent,
Right.
And all of that stuff was, I couldn't get away from it. I wanted to be around it so badly that I was willing to do it badly. But in the end, the great thing about the job is that it kind of gives you this job, the job that you and I have, is that you have a lot of exposure to a lot of people who do this for a living. And you get, like you said, you get a pretty accurate picture of what you're good at and what you're bad at. And I just, I kind of, through one way or another, not sure how it happened, but ended up with pretty decent car control. I'm an okay club racer. On a good day, in the right car, I can win, be on the podium. But the great part about it was, I've ridden with Formula One drivers. I've compared my data in the same race car on the same day to people who won Daytona and Le Mans and drove that same car that same day there with me. I know exactly how I'm terrible, and that's a long list. But in the end, the best thing you can do, and the thing that all of that, it pretty quickly kind of warped me into looking for, was the best thing you can do is focus on, all right, what am I not doing right? And if you don't know, think about, okay, well, how do I learn to get better? If you don't know what that is, buy a book, watch videos. Now there are, for the past 5 or 8 years, sims have been good enough that you can sit in your basement with either a VR helmet or a pretty decent sized monitor and dive into iRacing or Assetto Corsa, and like that stuff actually helps. And in the end, I think most people, it's very easy to get discouraged by, and I know I was, by what you don't do well. And the only shift in my thinking that ever helped was thinking, okay, well, I don't do that stuff well. Who cares? I started to meet these people who were the best in the world at this thing I did as a hobby and that I loved, and realized just how much of a gap there was between doing it on my level and doing it as, I don't know, an Alonso, for example, and thought, okay, cool. So I'm not going to get there, which suddenly frees me up to, I'm not going to be in Formula One, which frees me up to stink. and once you're okay with the fact that you stink, then you can, you take all the ego, it goes out the window, and you can just go, oh wow, now it just becomes so much easier to learn, right? That's what's so cool about it, is that you can get better at it at any point. You can get better at it at 80. You can get better at it at 14 years old. It's all the same process. That's what I love.
It's not like stick and ball sports where at a certain age your body won't cooperate.
Yeah. And it does. Don't get me wrong. Like it does.
But it
gets harder. But it's still you can still evolve and improve at it. It's rad.
Yeah, you can be a great racing car driver in your 50s. You probably can't hit a major league curveball in your 50s unless you are an ex-major league baseball player. Maybe then you could. But no, I think your advice is spot on, and we are lucky in this job. I've gotten the chance to pick the brains of a lot of pros. Some automotive journalists disdain having a right seat rider. I love it, especially when they talk, because they tell me how I'm screwing up and how to get better. Most of them, I've had a couple that were cranky, and when they're rude, it just makes you mad. But the ones who are nice about it tend to help me improve. I had one pro once tell me that I was driving an automatic transmission car around Gingerman at a performance driving school, and when I was braking, my right foot wasn't touching the carpet. I was hanging it in the air. I didn't even know I was doing it. He's like, you got to keep your heel on the carpet so that when you switch from gas to brake and brake to gas, you'll have more precision and more control. And he was right, because I was braking either too much or too little, or giving it too much gas or too little, and I wasn't getting enough precision. Now, thankfully, we're at Gingerman, which if you make a mistake at Gingerman, it's very, very forgiving, and it's a slow track, so relatively slow track, so you're not gonna have to be super precise. But long story short, having that advice, that was some free advice that I really took to heart and helped me become a better track driver from there. And speaking of becoming better at things, not only are you accomplished on track, obviously you're an accomplished writer too. Obviously the book coming out. What advice would you give? And this is always a tricky question for writers. I never know how to answer this. I don't get asked this question very often. I'm probably not good enough of a writer. But what advice would you give to young writers, especially those who are trying to break into the business and try and make their voice, try and get a job, basically?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, Tim, right? Because it is you look at you look at what we do, which is a cross between entertainment, information, and storytelling. And all of those, it's not like you can break it out and say, well, 30% of it is entertainment, and journalism is nothing but passing along information. Well, that's not how it works, right? It's a blend. And no matter how you do it, whether you end up, solely in podcasting or building websites or putting together television or putting together YouTube channel. And I've been lucky enough to do all of these things. The one thing that's at the core of it, that crosses over for all of them, is thinking about storytelling. And storytelling is ultimately just context. What is it about the idea or the moment or the thought you're trying to get across or the thing you experienced that makes somebody care, which really just comes down to what makes you care. The worst of the writers that I've met or read never get out of their own navel. They never stop thinking about how it impacts them. And the best ones, my heroes in this business and out, people still with us, people long gone, it was never about them. And that goes back to the whole ego thing, right? It's not remembering that your byline is not about you, remembering that the YouTube videos you make, even if they're solely focused on you, it's still not you. Who are you? I'm one of 11 billion people on this planet. I'm a nobody. We're all nobodies. The stories we're trying to tell, whatever they are bigger than us. And if you remember that, and if you keep that in the back of your head, suddenly it starts to seem, it's not a cheat code so much as just a lens that helps you, or at least it helped me, unlock things. Because in the end, stories are just about pulling apart why and how we do what we do, and we're all very, very different, but at the core, there's a handful of things that make us all the same in ways in which we're all the same, right? And that's again, that works, whether it's a YouTube channel, a podcast, or whether you're standing on a street corner, raving about the end of the world. It's just how well you can convince somebody that what you're saying matters. And that's figuring out what's universal about it,
Yeah. And I think you're right about the ego. I think there is in writing in general, just because it is something that you create, there is some natural built-in ego. And it's also true of making podcasts or making video or any content creation, really, where your name's on it. And also a lot of writers, myself included, try and do self-deprecation, right? Or try and include, I think you've done this in some of your writing as well, or we try and do XYZ thing happened to me. I'm not trying to make the story about me, but it's interesting, or it adds color. And there's a fine line between doing that and getting to, like you said, into your own navel. So I think it's one thing that all writers should keep in mind as they go forward. And just going back to the racing conversation, I think if you think you're a good track driver, ride shotgun with a pro, and you will realize that you suck, right? You will see the gap. And I think the same thing is true for writers. If you think you're a good writer, read someone who's really good. And even with the fact that they have editors and all that sort of thing, so it's not 100% their voice, it's like 95% their voice. Even that factored in, you'll understand you've got a long way to go. And speaking of that, we have taken up a fair bit of time today. We do appreciate our listeners tuning in. And Sam, we appreciate you coming on and talking about your book. And just as a reminder to our listeners, we have all sorts of holidays coming up. It's summertime, so graduations, Mother's Day in spring, Father's Day in June. And the book's title is Smithology, Thoughts, Travels, and Semi-Plausible Car Writings, 2003 to 2023, by Sam Smith, who is a journalist, automotive journalist and author, written for Road and Track and all sorts of other places. Sam, we appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you for having me. This was fun. I really appreciate it, Colin.
Tim,
I told you Colin.
I'm so sorry. That's okay. Colin is one of my coworkers, and Colin and I do look a little bit alike, so it's not exactly. It's understandable. So I'm trying to say. Yes.
Oh, forgive me. Oh, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, we thank Sam Smith from Road and Track, Haggerty, and a million other places for his time. And again, go out and buy the book. Again, it's called Smithology, Thoughts, Travels, and Semi-Plausible Car Writings, 2003 to 2023. That's all the time we have for this segment on the Truth About Cars podcast. Thank you for listening. Okay, here in the Truth About Cars podcast, we talk about NASCAR every week, and we've got Matthew Guy, TTAC contributor, along with me. I'm Tim Healy, the managing editor for Truth About Cars. We have Matthew Guy alongside me to talk about what happened in Darlington this past weekend. It was actually kind of a straightforward race, but there was some extracurricular activities at the very end. We'll talk about that a little bit, and we'll also talk about the throwback paint schemes. Now, Matthew, you probably saw more of the race than I did. I had some family things going on, but can you kind of walk us through what happened in Darlington?
The circus rolled into just a week after Kyle Larson. I mean, he won the closest ever NASCAR race at Kansas Speedway. Such a good show.
And we talked about it on the podcast, yeah.
So good, right? And then the circus rolls into South Carolina and the Darlington Raceway, which is just something that is so steeped in history. Mm-hmm. And I enjoy how Darlington they used to have, I believe they used to have years and years and ages ago, used to have the Labor Day race. And then it was moved to Mother's Day. And a lot of people thought that that's it, Darlington's done, right? And this was ages ago. But they really flipped the script. And it's still steeped in history, and they always have. We're going to talk, our listeners want to know, we're going to talk about the throwback paint schemes as well. That's something that is always popping up at Darlington every year, and I absolutely love it. But, I mean, it was Brad Keselowski, first win in 110 races, and it's first win of the season, obviously, and he just dominated it. The Goodyear 400. This is also Ford's first win of the 2024 season as well. So we haven't seen a Mustang in victory lane.
We haven't seen a Ford in victory lane. Well, they're all Mustangs, so it's the same thing. But yes.
Yeah, right. We haven't seen one. So
yeah.
It's really any Keselowski fans are very happy, and I would, I'd like to think it was the paint scheme, but probably not. I mean, there's a lot more. There's a lot of other things that go into the NASCAR race too, right? But
yeah. So let's talk about those paint schemes a little bit. I believe you said it was 16 cars that were doing throwbacks. The ones that stuck out to me were the number 5 car, Kyle Larson, had the kind of the cornflakes look from about, I don't remember how long ago that was, 10 or 15 years probably. And then there was the Jeff Gordon, the old kind of the Jeff Gordon in the 90s. Going through pictures of the cars on Darlington's website, some of the paint schemes, I'm going to date myself a little bit here, maybe in a good way, maybe show that I'm actually younger than people might think. But looking at all the paint schemes, a lot of them don't ring a bell to me, and that kind of coincides with my time away from NASCAR as a fan. I didn't watch NASCAR a ton during the aughts. There was no real reason for it other than maybe some of the drivers that I grew up rooting for had retired and they had just gotten older and retired. And I like Jeff Gordon well enough, and he's still relatively young, and he was around. And I watched a few other guys, Dale Earnhardt Jr. and some others, but I just wasn't as. Probably just had a bunch of stuff going on in my life where I just had a lot of just too busy on Sundays. But when you're in your 20s, you tend to have a lot going on. And it was also harder to record stuff back then than it is now. Now, if I'm going to miss a race, I can record it much more easily or watch highlights much more easily. So anyway, long story short, some of the car paint schemes I just don't remember that well. I'm more versed in the 90s, in early aughts, than I am the late aughts and whatever we call, I don't know, the 2010s. I don't know what or maybe the aughts would be the decade before. But anyway, so some of these paint schemes don't ring a bell to me the way they might to a more diehard NASCAR fan, but it is really cool to see them go back in time.
It's just fantastic. And Larson's car, the 5, because throwing back to 1996 that was his championship year with Terry Labonte. And just a classic paint scheme. I love how they.
I was going to say, I thought it was Terry Labonte. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And they just totally integrated the font of what it would have been Kellogg's, and then cornflakes with the color scheme and the proper number and everything like that. It looks so good. And fun fact, of course, Larson is almost not exclusively, but he's frequently sponsored by HendrickCars.com, owned by Mr. Hendrick, who owns the entire race team. And they initially, I remember reading this because you remember why Larson ended up at Hendrick, right? Because he was using foul language on a iRacing, I think it was.
Yeah, it was actually quite racist, but yes.
Exactly, right?
I do remember that, yeah.
Right, and so he got let go from there, and he ended up here, and no sponsor. He didn't quite get enough sponsors, so Mr. Hendrick put HendrickCars.com on Larson's car, and apparently saw traffic to that website skyrocket. So it was out of necessity that he put HendrickCars.com on there, but it ended up working. So anyways, there's just some backstory for some of our listeners. And I love how that 5-car looked. I think it was absolutely fantastic, throwing it back to 1996. And still sticking with some of the history. Chase Elliott in the 9. He ran a throwback to Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s 2014 Daytona 500 winning scheme. So that's where the stripes and the lines and everything.
Yeah, and that's one of the ones that I wouldn't remember. I'm actually a little bit thrown off here. So you're saying 1996 on Terry Labonte. I thought it was later.
96, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I thought it was later because I was maybe thinking of a different paint scheme. This is the problem with aging, is that your memories get a little jumbled, right?
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I'd have to actually go back and research all these cars. And the only one I can really think of off the top of my head is Jeff Gordon, just because he had that paint scheme for so long. And I wanted to ask you, too, were these actually painted or were these wraps? Because I know NASCAR's been doing wraps a lot lately because they're much easier to change between races than repainting a vehicle.
Yeah, to my knowledge, they are wraps,
Okay.
especially these. I was watching a YouTube video the other day about the Darlington throwback schemes, and they were showing someone doing a wrap of it. So I'm going to wager that if not 99%, if not all of what we saw on Sunday were wrapped cars.
Yeah.
And if a listener knows different, please chime in.
Yeah, for sure. And just going through the list again, just taking one more look at it. So some of these are all over the place. And one of them I don't remember because I was very little. The Tim Richmond car in 1982. Wouldn't remember that one. I don't remember this one because it doesn't have the year listed. But Daniel Suarez was actually racing a car that had an IndyCar wrap.
Yeah.
From Adrian Fernandez. And I do watch Indy 500 every year, but I do not recall that one. Some of them are pretty recent. One is from 2016, and so it's almost too recent to really feel classic to me, although I'm sure fans of Martin Truex Jr. might feel differently. And he's actually, I think, run that same paint scheme or something very similar this year, if I recall correctly, or within the past year or two anyway. So some of these things, and even the Jeff Gordon one was not his normal rainbow. It was more of a Firestorm one from 2009. So some of these cars, I love the idea of throwbacks, but some of these are a little bit obscure, at least for me. Maybe the hardcore NASCAR fans. And then there's another one that was in front of the racing series, and it was in the back of my head, and I could not quite place it. It was the Castrol that was, paying homage to the Toyota Supra. So so that was, not quite NASCAR, but for me, 3 or 4 recognizable. Another one I forgot about was the Jimmy Johnson 40 gate. That's not a very old one, but that's another recognizable one. So for me, I love the idea of throwbacks. I just wish it's part of me likes going a little more obscure and not being so obvious. But there's also a part of me that wishes there had been some really familiar ones. Maybe not Dale Earnhardt Sr. That might be a little bit disrespectful. But like Dale Earnhardt, or like a red Budweiser car, number 8, like Dale Earnhardt Jr. would have been cool. A Mark Martin or Sterling Marlin or something, and also only half the field approximately having throwbacks. Why not more? Well, I mean, I understand that maybe not every driver has a connection to the past, or not every team has a connection to the past, but most of these numbers have been used at some point. Why not do all 30, however many, I don't remember how many cars were in the race. It's usually around 33 or so. Why not do all 30-something cars or whatever it was? The NASCAR's been around long enough.
It has. And, I mean, barring any sort of licensing issues, I mean, that's
I was just going to say, that may be, I kind of answered my own questions I was talking. That may be part of it, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
It might be part of it, but, I mean, there have been times when, I don't know, let's say, I mean, I'm looking at the cars that are on my shelf here now, right? So, I mean, to do Davey Allison's 28 Havoline car would look amazing.
Yeah.
On the Mustang. It would look so good. To see the Kodak or the Pepsi Challenger from DW's days, right? I mean, that would look so good. And I think Dale Earnhardt Jr. did something similar to that at some point, because Jr. is such a historian. Much, that's blown out in the open now. He gets to talk about it a lot on his podcast, the history of NASCAR. But even during his racing days, he was certainly a big historian and paid a lot of tribute to the cars in the past.
Yeah,
so I'm thinking I want to look up now.
I'd love to see a Rusty Wallace or a Bill Elliott. This is I'm going to mark my age here, or whoever. I think it was Mark Martin had a Valvoline blue and white, red, white, and blue.
Yeah,
I know, like kind of like the L. Like I remember the L for junior cars, and it was kind of a similar version, but it was NASCAR instead of IndyCar. I'd like to see some of those from the 90s. Well, obviously the Terry Labonte, but I'd like to see more 90s throwbacks.
Me too. I think that would capture a lot of attention from people our age. I'm 44, so it would capture a lot of attention from people our age who watched it in the 90s.
Yeah, people between the ages of 35 and 50, for sure.
For sure. And then newer fans of the sport get to see something different. And back then, you really had someone's, if I wore a Valvoline jacket or a Valvoline t-shirt, which I did, right, in the mid-90s, you knew that I was a fan of Mark Martin because his car was number 6 Valvoline all throughout the year.
Right.
These days, sponsors, and this is out of necessity, this is just the way it is, but even someone who is very successful like Kyle Larson or Chase Elliott, their sponsor changes from week to week to week, right? With the 9 going from Napa to Hooters, and a whole bunch of different other sponsors in there. And that's the nature of the business these days. So that's why I think we see sometimes, some of my friends anyways, they'll wear a number 9 hat that just says 9 on it. It doesn't have the sponsor. And that's a conversation for another podcast about how that affects sales of things. Because for years, and you tell me if you did this too, because as an irrational teenager, I didn't like seeing Jeff Gordon winning all the time in the late 90s, right? So I actively did not drink Pepsi and chose Coke because Pepsi was his ancillary sponsor, right?
Yeah, no, I never did that.
How silly is that? And to this day, being 44 years old, I still prefer the taste of Coke.
Interesting. Yeah,
right?
So I never chose a product based on, not that I can remember anyway, based on, I never bought something because of NASCAR or a NASCAR driver had it on their car. I never avoided something. I did get annoyed with Gordon winning all the time at times when I was younger. And again, I think you're a bigger NASCAR fan than I am. When I was in my teens, I was paying attention, but not watching every race. I don't think I ever hated Gordon, though. And I think as I saw him do more interviews and stuff like that, I kind of came around to it. He seems like a real nice guy. I never met him.
Oh, he is.
But he never seemed annoying the way Tom Brady used to kind of annoy me when he was winning a football, or the way Bill Belichick used to. I had no reason to hate the Patriots. They're not a rival of any team that I like, but sometimes I don't mind a team that's winning. It's hypocritical. I rooted for the Chicago Blackhawks, who had a dynasty, recently. But I couldn't stand when the Patriots won. And I think part of it was because of the way that Tom Brady and Bill Belichick came across. And not that they're bad people or mean people. I mean, Belichick was just grumpy and Brady was just arrogant. But I think sometimes the way it comes across, to tie it back to racing, can affect how you perceive somebody. And Jeff Gordon, being a nice enough guy, I think took the edge off him winning so much.
Definitely.
And that's the other thing. I never did embrace Dale Earnhardt Sr. I mean, I'm obviously sad he passed. You didn't want him to, die in a car accident the way he did, or a crash the way he did, but you wanted him to retire and grow old like everybody else. But I never could fully root for him just because he was kind of aggressive on track. And he actually seemed like a nice enough guy off the track, if a bit gruff, but it was hard to really embrace him because of that. So I never did get to the point where I'm like, oh, I don't like Jeff Gordon, so I'm going to drink a different soft drink. You know what I mean? But that is funny. That is very funny.
I get you. And and that the same type of stuff. Like, I would choose Valvoline motor oil and it didn't matter because the car I had at the time burned more oil than gasoline.
Yeah, I get that. Well, it actually did matter then because you're putting a lot of oil in.
No, I put a lot of oil in it, yeah. I probably should have just used secondhand motor oil. But the cool thing with the Valvoline paint schemes, I just went back and looked real quick, and Dale Earnhardt Jr., I don't remember this, but Dale Earnhardt Jr. had a throwback scheme in 2015.
Okay.
Which looks absolutely fantastic. And there was also one, William Byron did one not too long ago, because he hasn't been racing relatively all that long. In my mind, he's still one of the new guys, right?
I think he is only been 4 or 5 years in, I think.
Yeah. So that I mean, it's super cool. I absolutely enjoy how they do these throwback schemes.
And correct me if
And
I'm wrong, but doesn't Byron often run a version of the old Jeff Gordon paint scheme?
I think so. I think
Yeah,
so.
it's not
And
exactly the
he
same, but it's recognizable.
close enough.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 And,
But this
and speak. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, and these schemes, both of them, and again, I wonder if it's a licensing thing because both of them come back to Cale Yarborough's car when he ran the 75 Valvoline,
Okay.
not
Okay.
not the Jack Roush number 6 Valvoline. They're very
Yeah.
similar,
Right.
very similar, but they all reference the 75 and not the 6. So I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it has something to do with that too.
And before we wrap our NASCAR segment, we do have to discuss, speaking getting close, Chris Buescher got pretty close into the face of Tyler Reddick yesterday. Actually, Reddick still had his helmet on. And I'll read the transcript of the fight that they had. I wouldn't call it a fight, more as a heated discussion. There was no physical, no one punched anybody. But it was definitely, they looked like they collided near the end of the race. One of them was driving a little bit aggressively. I think it was Buescher, if I remember correctly. And Buescher came out and said, "What was that? What was that?" I'm reading a transcript posted to Twitter from NASCAR reporter Jeff Gluck. He says, "What was that? What was that?" And then in parentheses, so something about racing clean. So Buescher said something inaudible about racing clean. And then Reddick says, "I know I effed up," but he said the word. "I'm sorry." And Buescher said, no crap, but stronger version of that. And Reddick said, "Hey, Chris, I'm really," and then Buescher cut him off, said, "We have raced each other clean. What was that about?" And Reddick says, "I knew as soon as that wasn't going to work, I tried to back out." So I think he made a maneuver and it just didn't work. And he says, "And I got the last thing I wanted to do was wreck your car. I can care less about mine." Pet peeve of mine, he should have said I could not care less. "I can care less about mine. I'm sorry. I effed up. I effed up." Buescher said, "It doesn't work for me. We don't have that winner sticker on our door right now. You need to be better." Reddick didn't hear him, asked him to repeat himself. Buescher says, "I don't have that sticker on my door. This means more. I need you to be better. We've raced each other just fine for so long." And Reddick said, "I know, I'm sorry." So I didn't catch the beginning of it, but it was live on the broadcast. I was talking with my dad and all of a sudden saw it start. And I don't know if you saw it. I don't know if you saw what happened leading up to it. Fox did replay it. It looks like they hit each other on the last lap or second to last lap, but no one wrecked. It was just a bump. And neither one even finished that high. It was, I don't know if they got knocked out of the running because of that. I don't really recall. But Brad Keselowski was the one who ended up walking away with the win. So what happened there?
He is, and you're right, because I mean, Reddick is currently 6th in the championship. I mean, he's effectively locked into the playoffs by virtue of the win at Talladega. But Buescher is, and he makes his point about the not getting the win and the not having the winner sticker on their car, because he's in the field, on points in 12th?
Yeah, and he finished second. He finished close to the, last week he should have. He almost wanted that close to finish. I'm not gonna say should have, but he was a nose hair from winning. So I'm sure he was
Nose hair from winning. And
Yeah.
that frustration boils over to this week too, because he is so close and he wants that win. But he doesn't have it. He doesn't have the in-season security that comes from a race win to lock his place into the playoff field. So it would have allowed him to spend the next 13 races prepping for the playoffs, and that's another discussion altogether about how these playoffs work. But with the luxury of the Reddick and his 23XI racing team, they already have that luxury in hand, right? And I think that was Buescher's main point, was that, hey, come on, you already got your win. And that's an interesting dynamic that I'm not sure the people who designed this version of the NASCAR point system anticipated was going to happen, So, but you're right, and one of them still had their helmet on, and it wasn't, fisticuffs. And I think a lot because of one party saying, "Yep, okay, yep, no, I did this and did that, and that wasn't right," and then with the other guy saying, "No, you didn't," and then being like, "Okay, now what? I can't knock stuffing out of you. You already said you were wrong."
Yeah, I've never raced, not even a dirt track on a Friday night in the middle of nowhere, so I don't know what it's like to get that kind of emotion. And most of the times when we see these discussions, which have sometimes in the past evolved into fights, when you see these discussions, a lot of times you can sort of take both sides and say, well, he was racing hard, it was fair, but it was just aggressive. And then you can see the other side, well, I see why that guy was upset. Very, very rarely is it a clear cut, someone being unfair or crossing lines, ethical lines, or potentially hitting somebody, something like that. And of course, in NASCAR, there is a little bit of bumping, a little bit of intentional hitting that goes on. And to an extent, as long as you're not wrecking somebody, it is kind of acceptable. Well, you can wreck someone by accident with trying to, but as long as you're not intentionally wrecking people, it usually doesn't get people too upset. So, although, like we did see a few weeks ago, I think it was Talladega with that big wreck at the end where a guy made a move and bumped him, and he wasn't trying to hit him, but he did. So anyway, my point is that in racing, it can be a really fine line between aggressive driving and crossing those lines into being dirty. So I think this is one of those examples where it's really hard to say one person or the other was wrong. And I'm just glad, as much as we love the drama on social media and a sports center, I'm kind of glad it didn't go to fisticuffs. And I do feel a little bit bad for Fox having to, the bad words went out over the broadcast. And I'm sitting there like, I know we don't swear on our podcast because it's easier for us to manage it. But, I'm sitting there thinking like, oh, who cares if he says a bad word? But of course, Fox is going to get fined probably just because they're carrying it live and no delay. So, or if there was a delay, they weren't quick enough to press the bleep button. So I did feel a little bad for them, but I'm glad there was no fisticuffs. It was just a heated conversation.
Yeah, and you're near winner 1 week ago in Kansas, and they were door slamming each other coming up to the 0.001 second finish, and then now Chris Buescher, that is, finishes third after that contact. So that's definitely the genesis of his frustration. And, the other guy owned up to it. So then that just diffuses the situation and starting knocking heads right away. So, but they'll get him next. Well, no, I was going to say they'll get him next week, but next week's the All-Star race, isn't it? I believe.
I believe so.
Yeah. So they'll get him. So he said he's looking forward to the 600 after the All-Star race, which I'm still old enough to call the World 600, not the Coke 600. Anyways. Yeah. It's a little bit, isn't the Coke, let me just check the schedule real quick. Isn't the Coke 600 Memorial Day weekend? Because is Kyle Larson doing the double? He is going to attempt it, from what I understand, yes.
I know he said he was racing the 500, so I don't know if so just to kind of go through the Cup Series schedule for our listeners before we wrap our segment here. You are correct, sir, I'm sorry, I have the wrong date in front of me. Yes, you are correct, I believe. Oh, again, wrong date. Yeah, sorry, you are correct. It is the NASCAR All-Star Open at North Wilkesboro. That's on Sunday in the early afternoon, and evening time is the All-Star race itself. So it'll be 100 laps. And then Coca-Cola 600 is, as always, Memorial Day weekend in the evening. And with the 6 o'clock Eastern start time, assuming Kyle Larson's doing both, he should be able to finish the Indy 500, which wraps around 2 o'clock Central typically, if there's no weather delays.
Yeah.
It's usually the Indy 500 goes quickly as long as there's not a lot of cautions. It usually ends pretty quick. So between 2 and 3 o'clock Central, so it's about 4 o'clock Eastern. Yeah, if he gets a quick helicopter, he should be good to go.
I agree. That's going to be interesting to keep an eye on. I'm looking forward to that too. So that's what we've got coming up on our podcast for next week, All-Star Race. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that, that's all the time we have for our NASCAR segment today. eBay Motors is here for the ride with some elbow grease, fresh installs, and a whole lot of love. You transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own. Brake kits, LED headlights, whatever you need, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. This has been the Truth About Cars podcast. We thank Sam Smith for coming on today. Sam is an automotive journalist and author, and he came on to talk about his book, Smithology, Thoughts, Travels, and Semi-Plausible Car Writings, 2003 to 2023. We also had TTAC contributor Matthew Guy stop by to discuss power inverters as well as NASCAR. I'm Tim Healy. I'm the managing editor for The Truth About Cars. You can find us at thetruthAboutCars.com. That's all spelled out. Or TTAC, that's TTAC.com. We thank Sam. We thank Matthew. We thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.